Oh, well, hello everybody. Today is the end of the Heart of Thorns review. I'm currently sitting here at my desk after having finished the final scripts for these many videos. I think the entire thing ended up like 13 different scripts that I ended up writing through the end of it. As always, this was a series that ended up getting way too long and kind of snowballed out from in front of me. For people who maybe only just recently watched this has actually been in the works for 6 months or so. Not that I've been working for 6 months the whole way through, but about 6 months is what it's taken. And I wanted to take today to talk to you a little bit more casually. I have no formal script or anything I'm reading from on this, but to kind of wind down and conclude and talk a little bit about Heart of Thorns overall. I found this really interesting to basically construct because we can get bogged down in very small nitty-gritty details and give a lot of feedback about small stuff, but the overall message might be lost. So I did feel like it was worthwhile going back and looking at everything that we've said about Heart of Thorns here and giving kind of how I feel about it. Many of you in the comments as the series has gone along have said, hey, I think I'm detecting some common themes. Stuff like, hey, it really seems like the devs bit off more than they could chew, or hey, the devs had backed themselves into a corner, they didn't give themselves enough time to make Heart of Thorns, and so forth. So, what I want to do, guys, is just quickly run through some of your feedback on each of the different parts of the review, and maybe add some things that I didn't quite express before that I kind of regret now that I didn't. And I think probably one of the best places for us to start is the Masteries video. So generally you guys loved what I had to say about Masteries. I think we were pretty on point with how the community generally feels, but there was one controversial opinion there. It was an opinion I knew would be controversial at the time, and this is my discussion of how much stronger I feel Masteries could have been if they were designed from the ground up to be character bound rather than account bound. And to be very clear about this for people, my suggestion isn't to just take what we currently have in Guild Wars 2 and make it character bound now and call it a day there, because obviously that would be awful. I think a lot of people heard me say that and envision themselves under a current character bound scenario and think that's crazy. And that, you know, I even had people say, WP, don't you realize this is X million amount of experience and this is X amount of mastery points and I don't want to do this again and again. That was never really my suggestion, and I did have in the script there that wasn't really my suggestion. My point is that when we think about the developers in a room creating Heart of Thorns and creating this big part of Heart of Thorns, and not just Heart of Thorns, but all expansions of the future, it's crazy to me to think that they decided to make it account bound from the start. What I lament is the fact that they didn't stick to their guns and make it character bound from the start. And then, yes, rein the experience acquisition in, maybe get rid of the idea of needing points and experience altogether, and produce at the end a different system that doesn't feel like a chore to go through, but it's something to celebrate and enjoy going through, which is what we experience in video game adventure games, particularly that aren't necessarily MMOs. So that was kind of my point there, and I think a lot of people got it, but some people thought I was just basically saying, oh, we should swap it to character bound. No, I'm not that much of a masochist. That's pretty crazy. And my case in point as well, guys, like, this review's been really interesting to do, and as you've seen, I've been mostly drawing from that original PAX South presentation where they gave us all the headlining features. And it's funny because the way Colin Johansson summed up, who at the time was game director, what Heart of Thorns was supposed to be and what Guild Wars 2 was supposed to be, what he zeroed in on as the essence of Guild Wars 2 was this line.
All of these features make up a core experience. It answers fundamental questions of where Guild Wars 2 can go in the future and builds back to the core philosophy that we set out when we started to build Guild Wars 2 long ago. That is, that the journey should be the goal, and each of these features complements that. We cannot wait to take that journey with all of you.
That the journey is the goal. So it's crazy to me to think that if the journey is the goal, why have you built a system that you can only ever experience that journey once before never doing it again? But hey, I appreciate this will be a topic that there's a little bit of contention on, but overall I think the video is pretty interesting. Moving on, talking about the Revenant a little bit, just some minor stuff here. I think a lot of people really liked what I had to say about the Revenant, though two things that I didn't get to that I really think I should have. I was talking a lot about the theming and the story and the placement of the Revenant in the world, just as I criticized Elite Specializations. And I still very much stand by those, though one thing, I didn't give the devs the credit they deserve. At least the Revenant had its like special dodge roll animation of the mist. And there is kind of an aspect to Revenant I never got to at all, which is and kind of a mechanical side of them, that they have a lot of abilities that have built-in evade frames where it's like they're stepping into the mist, like their kind of weird version of shadow steps, if you will. And that is a big part of the Revenant's flavor, and it does have a bit of an identity there. I think I was a little bit too harsh on that. But the other big thing of Revenant that I really do feel I should have talked about was corruption, and MENACES particularly. I talked about how the Revenant is kind of wacky with its balance right now, in that it kind of can't play condition very comfortably, and this may be because it doesn't have a convincing alternate weapon set and so forth, and maybe we have to wait for an elite specialization to combo into MENACES. But there's a big part of this too, and that's that corruption and the condition damage playstyle was actually really fun in the betas, and they gutted it and removed it and rebalanced all of it because they didn't like that there was some slightly counterintuitive gameplay associated with what the original elite skill did. And I still to this day really detest what they did there, because it was such an interesting area and aspect of the Revenant that then got totally canned, and MENACES is so uninteresting now. There's also a lot of stuff from Revenant that I really like mechanically I didn't talk about, that are some interesting gameplay synergies we never saw before. Like when a Revenant uses their Sword 3 on a Mesmer who happens to go through a portal, and you teleport the Revenant with you, that stuff is amazing, and I wish I'd mentioned it in the original video. A couple of people pointed that out. Another highlight for me is the hammer, that you can sort of dislocate the Revenant from the camera in this unique kind of engine skill, and you can blink yourself far away and claim points of interest and things you shouldn't really have when you use the hammer. That's all really interesting gameplay and nuanced stuff that they've built into the engine for Heart of Thorns that the core game never had. Like, even if Mace is kind of weak in terms of balance right now, the feeling of using that cascade attack on the Mace, and indeed just cascade attacks in general, there are a lot of things that the Revenant and Elite Specializations in general pushed with Heart of Thorns that I never gave enough credit, I think, in the original pass through the review. That leads me into another thing, and that's balance. So there is no one dedicated episode of balance that I did in this review, and I think maybe if I was going back to the start of this and I had infinite amounts of time, I probably would have done it. So when I started talking about this review, and when I started concepting it out for myself, I decided not to talk about balance because I reasoned that generally anything I say on balance could get changed like immediately, and then it's just useless, and I want this to be as timeless as possible. And I thought that was a respectable decision to go with at first, but a huge part of my enjoyment in making this has been to kind of document and to catalog how things were and how things went. And so the truth is, if balance was really bad in World vs. World with regard to stability for months and months and months, maybe that should have made it into the review. And it was really interesting as I continued writing to see how much balance affects this game. Balance is everywhere. When we talk about the Revenant, a huge amount of the discussion ends up leaning on balance, and people's upset or positivity towards the Revenant relies on balance. You know, the nerfing of their sword, or the nerfing in the early days, or the nerfing of their F2 ability and the balance of how much boon duration should be in the game, or the gutting, like I just said, of the corruption tree. Or then when we look at Stronghold, so much of what was good or bad about Stronghold can end up becoming a discussion of balance. Same with Conquest. Every single season that we've had in Conquest is entirely a question of balance. Elite Specializations, balance is the big thing on everyone's mind. When we talk about World vs. World, what's a huge thing to go on about there? It's about the difference between the pirate ship meta, between the balance of how much stability's been around, between the pushing out of warriors essentially from frontlining in World vs. World ever since Heart of Thorns came out. It's all balance. Balance is everywhere. And so it really has shown me, making this review, just how important this game having split balance and good balance is, because man, so many of these features can be fundamentally great, but held back by poor balancing decisions. And so many of these videos I could have just gone on huge amounts of discussion about that. So maybe if you guys want to add for other people watching who maybe will go to the comments and check stuff out, your thoughts on balance from various areas of the game, you're more than welcome to it. Moving on, we did obviously a lot of discussion on guild stuff. Something kind of interesting for you guys, the guild stuff is actually what this whole review started with. I kind of had two inspirations for the review, but one of them was that I'd recently really got into the guild stuff, and I saw the fact that barely anyone in Guild Wars 2 really understood guild stuff. This was a very misunderstood part of Heart of Thorns, and there are very good reasons why not many people have been able to engage with it. So I really wanted to show people what that was like, and I basically started out just writing a review of the guild features, and the more I wrote about it, I started feeling the pull to talk about world versus world, and I started to feel the pull about talking about other things. Like, one of the ideas I had that I really wanted to talk about with the maps was that I think the map currencies should offer decorations you can buy, because that would add so much more infinite replayability basically to the 4 Heart of Thorns maps, where you can spend that currency then on decorations and then build those decorations into trophies or other ones, and so forth and so forth. It all started with the guild stuff, really, and that's why the guild episodes were so long. A few of you guys were upset when, say, in the PvP and World vs. World video, I didn't talk more about World vs. World, and I said, sorry guys, the video is getting too long. Well, that looks kind of weird as a comment when the guild videos were both well over an hour, right? But the guild ones weren't exactly typical. They were the older scripts, and if anything, I think they probably were a little bit too long, and not everybody really even ended up checking those ones out. So yeah, the guild features, I think I had really, really awesome feedback on those. People talking about how the World vs. World really couldn't take into them because they're under PvE balance, and that means stuff like the new mastery that gives you a new downstate skill affects that place too. And some other people pointed out, like, hey, some people do use the portal, and I was a little bit scathing about it. I was very glad to see the amount of people agreeing that these guild maps are just way too big. The guild hall maps, to me, feel a lot like the desert Borderlands, in that they are so beautiful and so huge, yet also, in terms of like a regular PvE perspective, really derelict. It's amazing to think if these maps could just, you know, can't they just be regular Heart of Thorns maps, please? Can you just put regular events in? Because they'd be amazing to explore in a traditional way, and that's why I was so impassioned about that guild hall feedback that I ended up giving and trying to explain what guilds were in Heart of Thorns. So another video we did was on raiding. My opinions on raiding were unquestionably the more controversial of any of my opinions here, and it's just because there is this very fundamental fragment, this split in the PvE community right now of whether you believe raids was ever something that Guild Wars 2 was meant to have or not. And I really do believe in what I said, that Guild Wars 2 didn't bait and switch us with raids, and I can only speak from my personal experiences, which is that raids did give me a huge amount of playtime and a huge amount of joy, and they've been a big part of Heart of Thorns for me, and so, you know, I want to applaud that where I see that. Though, of course, we all have our opinions. I think mostly people were very civil, and it's curious to see whether the devs will continue making them easier as they go along, because that's something I wish I'd mentioned more about. I wish I'd talked more about the accessibility of raids. I talked about why I love them, but I think what people were really seeing, they wanted to identify with, was hearing about how inaccessible they can feel when you are socially muscled out, where you don't have a guild and you don't know how to get friends and you don't have much achievement points and you don't have many legendary insights and stuff. So, and hopefully I've got some more videos in this playlist that will help to touch onto that in a second. I also wish I'd talked a bit more on build diversity, about how actually a lot of builds are possible in raids, only once you get an actual team though. Once you're with competent people, it really doesn't even matter how closely to the meta you play, because a lot of stuff becomes more viable. But there's a very tight meta of builds you can only run when you're looking at LFG, and that's what most people are interested in. So yeah, then we had the World vs. World stuff. Amazing response from you guys in the comments. I know that because I don't play much World vs. World, couldn't do a great job on this review with it, but you guys really pulled through. There was some incredible stuff. We even actually had a developer response to the Reddit topic for that video on this idea of what do World vs. Worlders want. You know, it's really upsetting maybe that World vs. World don't have that one unifying voice or that one representative for themselves. And so, you know, we even had a dev talking about that a little bit, and the way that player polling went on. Like, I didn't talk about player polls in World vs. World. Over the Heart of Thorns days, the devs have actually allowed the community en masse to vote for what happens with World vs. World. They've changed their perspective as people who decide what happens to the game type than just people that instead steward the game type, I believe is what they described, and they let the community decide where World vs. World is going. And you know, that's been some real back and forth and transparency we hadn't seen until the Heart of Thorns days, which was also really wonderful. So yeah, that's really the series, guys. That's how it went. So what do we say about Heart of Thorns in general? Let's go back to the start of the review. Let's go back to this question of, is it value for money? Well, to me, it's absolutely value to money. It was value to money from the second that they bundled the core game into it. As I said way back at the start, if Guild Wars 2 was worth the money in 2012, the game is not that old and it's not that dated, and the core games had updates as well. If the core game was worth it in 2012, then certainly Heart of Thorns, for the same price, is worth it here in 2015. And if we're purely going to boil this down to a monetary discussion, it's kind of funny actually, because in the middle of this series, the devs permanently price dropped Heart of Thorns to now, I think it's $30. So they dropped it permanently. Maybe we'll see future expansions be at that price as well. And at that, I mean, I really, and after almost 2 years of updates, I don't think you can say that it's not value for money. I really don't. Maybe the line does get a bit blurred when you consider what free-to-play people get versus Heart of Thorns. Maybe the lines get a little bit blurred if you don't consider Living World Season 3 to be a part of Heart of Thorns, because if you missed it when it originally came in, you need gems, and then if you think that gems are only real-world money instead of also in-game money, depending on your own sensibilities, the lines will be blurred. But I really think it was. I absolutely do. And if I wanted to boil everything that we said in these hours and hours and hours of feedback down into one sentence, a single sentence, for all of those of you out there who want a soundbite, this is what my sentence would be. Heart of Thorns was an expansion with much quality, but little in quantity. And what I mean by that is that what they did put in was really impressive, as long as they could sustain themselves putting it in. If we had more maps like the ones we got, which were so incredible, people would have been less critical about the few that we did get. If we had more legendaries and faster, people would have been more accepting of the collections changing. If we had more story, then there would have been more opportunity to prop up the weak areas of the narrative. If more effort had gone into the new game type Stronghold, then we could have seen that genuinely flourish. If they had spent more time on masteries to give them more precedence in the world than just flavor text and the user interface, we could have seen the system be so much better. If they'd spent more time on elite specializations, giving them their respective places in the actual world, like quests to acquire them, then we could have seen the system be much better. This one thing seems to generally hold true for nearly everywhere in Heart of Thorns. And that's why when I look at the post-release support, which we talked about so early on, it makes me that happy, because they have put a mind-blowing amount of content into this game and continue to do so with, as of this review, episode 5 coming up. So there will be 6 episodes of Heart of Thorns, and then we're rolling into the next expansion, and I guess I'll be there to do this all again, and we'll see what the devs have learned. Thanks for watching this series, guys. My inspiration for it, a bit of behind the scenes, if you guys are interested, was actually a while ago. I came across a guy who did a similar review in length and so forth for a TV show, Lost, which I was once upon a big fan of. It's called KRYTA Reviews Lost, and he did like this ridiculous manifesto on the show, and I was so impressed by it. I thought, hey, why don't I do that about something I'm passionate about, which is this Heart of Thorns here. You can find a link to his thing in the description if you like. And yeah, it kind of did start as guild system feedback, but then these things kind of snowballed into each other. In the end of the playlist here, I'm going to include what I'm calling a bunch of satellite videos. So these are going to be extra videos you can watch that feed into the whole of the review, even though they weren't necessarily formally developed for it. So I've got several videos that I made, 3 of them, based around guild halls, again, because I really cared about the guild hall stuff. You'll find those deeper on the review, where I can talk to you more about how global cap works and how local cap and stuff works. You've already seen the story review, which I did actually very shortly after Heart of Thorns came out, because I really cared about the story. But I'll also implement stuff like an account tour. So this Christmas, long after Heart of Thorns came out, I did a big tour of my account as an established player of the game, the kind of things that I go for, what drives me to continue playing this expansion, and the things that I have still on the horizon. And I think a video like that is going to be really interesting to anyone who's still not quite sure how much Heart of Thorns has to do. The account tour, if anything, is one of the best videos I can show you, just to whet your appetite and let you see how much this expansion really has to offer people. So we'll do all of those. If you guys have any suggestions as well, fans of my channel that watch a lot of my stuff, if you have suggestions for more satellite videos, please feel free to talk about them in the comments, and I will put those on the playlist forevermore, so that even, you know, a decade from now, people can come here, they can look at this playlist, and they will know, generally, jaded by my biases, how the Heart of Thorns days went. Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you did like the series, please don't be so scared to support it any way you like. if this ends up, you know, getting very well liked or a lot of viewership and things, it will be something I consider for the future expansion. And if you're really a huge fan, I have a Patreon where if you submit to, you can get higher quality versions of these videos and all that good stuff. May as well plug at the end. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. This has been the big Heart of Thorns review. Whew. All right, now we can get back to other work. See you next time.
Let's talk next about lore. Guild Wars 2 has an incredibly deep and rich lore and history, stretching back over a decade now. And we want to give people the opportunity to master the lore of the jungle itself. And so you'll be able to spend mastery points to learn to understand the languages of the civilizations deep within the jungle. And as you learn those languages, you're going to learn the history of those civilizations, the secrets of those civilizations, and you'll even gain access to hidden locations that those civilizations have buried away, that only those who can speak and understand the language will be able to access.